Hi, I'm Dr. Leslie Blankenship-Williams, and in this lecture, we are going to do a brief survey of pathogens that are also fungi, also known as fungal pathogens. Before we do that, let's take a quick look at where we've been and where we are going in terms of our survey of pathogens. So when I think about the pathogens, I break them down first into those that are living. So remember, living organisms are made up of cells. They replicate somewhat independently. They are able to do metabolism. And then we have non-living. So non-living pathogens are not alive. They're not made of cells. They're usually smaller. They have some similarities with living organisms in terms of their ability to replicate, but they cannot do so usually independently. So when we think about non-living and living, in terms of the category of the living, we can further break it down based on cell type. So there are two major cell types. Prokaryotic, which is smaller, simpler, does not have a true nucleus, does not have membrane-bound organelles, is always unicellular. And under the prokaryotic cell types, the major group or domain that makes up human pathogens would be bacteria. Now, that's not to say that all bacteria are pathogenic. In fact, very few are. But that the other group, archaea, is rarely pathogenic and really doesn't contribute, that we know of, in any significant way to human disease. So we just ignore the archaea and we focus on the bacteria. And we spent all of last module covering some of the bacterial pathogens and the diseases that they are responsible for. The other cell type is the eukaryotic cell type. And eukaryotic cells, of course, are bigger. They have a true nucleus, they have membrane-bound organelles, and they can often form multicellular organisms. Within the eukaryotic domain, we have several kingdoms that contain some human pathogens: the animals, the fungi, and the protists. So examples of animal-human pathogens would be infectious worms. Fungi we're going to cover here, and then protists include things like African sleeping sickness and malaria. So in this class, we have already covered bacterial pathogens. In this lecture, we're going to look at fungal pathogens. The next lecture, we'll look at protist pathogens, and then we'll come back and take a look at some animal pathogens, and then we'll spend the rest of our time looking at the viruses. So let's get started on the fungal pathogens. When I say fungus, what do you think of? Chances are you think of something like that, a mushroom. How many of you thought of a mushroom when I said fungus? Probably most of you. Now, if I tell you that there are a number of different fungal pathogens or fungi that can infect humans, when was the last time you saw a mushroom growing out of somebody's living body? I don't know about you, but I have never seen one. And I guess that's not to say it never has existed, but would be incredibly rare if it did. So that must mean that somehow fungi don't just make mushrooms. Well, in fact, mushrooms are just one of their structures. Their major structure for fungi is not as easily seen. When we think of a fungal cell, I have one here. The fungal cells tend to aggregate together into long strands, like so. And those long strands have a name. They're called hyphae. When the hyphae start branching out and creating a messy mat, so if this is a strand of hyphae, it might kind of look like this. We call that mycelium. So the basic body plan of a fungus is actually hyphae and mycelium, or hyphae and mycelium. And you can actually see both that and the mushroom structure in this picture down here. Okay, so let's take a look at this picture. Up here, we have the mushrooms. In the dirt, we have mycelium. And you can see all of that mycelium, like right here, all that white stuff. That's all this kind of spider web mesh that is normally not visible to us because it's under the dirt for these types of species. So what is the mushroom? Well, the mushroom is simply basically taking some of that hyphae and pulling it up into a new structure that looks something like this. Now, why would they do that? Why would fungi want to do that? Well, that's referred to as what's called their fruiting body. And if you know anything about fruit, fruit was used in reproduction of plants. And in the same way, the fruiting body is used as part of the reproductive cycle of the fungi. Now, fungi that live in the soil need a way to disperse their spores. So fungi make spores, not terribly unlike bacterial spores. Some similarities are that they're hardy in kind of the same way. Dissimilarities are that fungal spores are the result usually of some sort of fungal reproduction, sexual reproduction, whereas bacterial spores are not related to bacterial sexual reproduction, because we know that bacteria do not do sexual reproduction. So back to my original point here, these fungal spores need a way to get out, and if they are trapped, and I'll just draw, like, let's say this is a spore down here. If they're trapped in the soil, they really don't have any way to move. The fungus comes out of the ground and puts their spores inside the mushroom and then waits for the wind or the rain to disseminate it. Well, fungi that infect humans are usually adapted to being pathogenic and don't really need to do that because we move. Because we move, the fungi don't need to make their own mushrooms inside of our bodies, so we don't see mushrooms. What we see instead are the hyphae and the mycelium. And here's another picture just showing that mycelium. And so you can see it looks like a messy mat, almost like a spider web type of aggregation of cells. So when we have a fungal spore that is pathogenic, like so, it ends up germinating and forming these hyphae. And these hyphae are really good at digging down into our membranes, whether it be skin or whether it be the mucous membrane. So fungi tend to like to be where the skin is or the mucous membrane is, because the spores will germinate into these vegetative cells, which will then form these hyphae or hypha that kind of dig down into our epithelial lining or endothelial lining, much like tree roots can dig into concrete. And for that reason, the fungi are particularly good at infecting our skin and infecting our mucous membranes. So let's take a look at what fungi do in our bodies. Whew. It is a really complex situation. Everybody has fungi in their body somewhere, most commonly associated with their microflora. So remember, microflora are going to be microorganisms that live on surfaces in our body and tend to live there for some prolonged period of time if they're considered to be resident microflora, or maybe in passing if they're considered to be transient microflora. When we think about all the different species that we might find in our mouth, for instance, we might call that a microbiome. So I'll use that term. You're not going to be tested on it, but I just wanted you to be aware that when we look at all the different species in a particular microflora aggregation, that is called the microbiome. And fungi are always a part of the microbiome. In the mouth, in the digestive system, in the vaginal canal, on the skin, etc. And their roles vary because of lots of different things, both the species involved and also what the host, you or me, are doing. So they can be helpful and they can be harmful, or they can be not really that important one way or another. So it's a big range. There are cases where infectious yeast, which is Candida albicans, we'll be seeing that species shortly, are actually helpful to you. There are many cases where it's life-threatening and can cause death in you. There are many cases where it doesn't seem to do one thing or another. It's not helpful nor harmful. So it's a complicated role. Now, one thing you might notice here is that when you take a look at the Candida cells, here, they're really just still cells. Notice they haven't germinated and made a whole lot of hyphae. Here, there's a little bit of germination. This is starting to show, maybe they're starting to be a little bit problematic. And here, they're really problematic. So here they've germinated. They're starting to try to dig down into the tissues, and we have an inflammatory response to them, which you can see with the movement of neutrophils and other immune cells to that area. Okay, so now that I've taken a look at the idea that fungi are not simple, nor is their relationship with us simple, let's go ahead and review a few of the different fungal species that cause infections. So one of the things that makes fungi somewhat interesting is their ability to penetrate and colonize our skin, which is typically very difficult to do. But again, they have hyphae and they can dig down into our dermis. And then also their ability to get into our mucous membranes. So the two groups of species that we are going to be covering are going to be the Tinea genus and Candida albicans, which is probably the most clinically important fungal infection that you'll come across. Certainly probably the most common one that you'll see. So that's not an exhaustive list. I'm just doing a brief survey, and those are the two groups that I've selected. So we'll start with Tinea. Tinea causes something known as ringworm. Now, ringworm, interestingly enough, is a misnomer. There is no worm. A fungus is not a worm. A worm is an animal. It's a fungal infection that, when it manifests itself, tends to look like a worm may have burrowed into the skin, like so, and created a ring shape, and hence the term ringworm. But really, that's your own inflammatory response to the presence of that particular fungus. Ringworm are caused by a variety of members of the genus Tinea. So you'll want to write that down. Tinea causes various forms of ringworm. Now, different species can cause different forms. You are not responsible for knowing the different species. You are responsible for knowing that Tinea causes ringworm, and that ringworm can manifest itself in a number of ways. All types of ringworm have something to do with the cutaneous layer. So that's going to be your skin or your nails. So one type of Tinea causes body ringworm, and that's body ringworm right there. Interestingly enough, that's actually my son when he was about 2.5 years old. He picked up ringworm from his daycare. Now, it's very common for body ringworm to show up among young children. And the reason is because their skin is somewhat thin and easily abraded. So here's the scenario. You have a small child wearing shorts, it's summer out, and they're at their daycare center on indoor-outdoor carpeting because it's really durable. But it's also a little bit sandpapery, and so they scoot across the floor to get something, and they put all these little micro abrasions in their skin, and the fungal spores get in and then germinate and create hyphae, and then you have a ringworm infection. When he had his ringworm infection, I actually had to bandage it up every single day that he went so that spores would not leak out of his infectious wound and continue to propagate. If you have ringworm that shows up around the groin area, that is called jock itch. And jock itch was somewhat prevalent in the 60s and 70s, maybe even the 80s, when people were sharing jock straps. I cannot believe I have to say this out loud, but that's probably not something we should be engaging in, sharing jock straps. One person would have jock itch, and their skin would shed all of these fungal spores, and it would land in the jock strap, and somebody else would put on that jock strap, and guess what? They would transmit it. So you'd get these outbreaks among like football teams and stuff. Another probably very well-known form of ringworm is in the foot. And when you have ringworm in the foot, that is referred to as athlete's foot, as shown here. A common way to get athlete's foot is in communal showers where people are walking barefoot across standing water. And the idea is somebody previously who had athlete's foot is spewing spores out of their skin, like right in here. and it's landing in the standing water, and then somebody else steps in and the spore attaches to the skin and starts germinating with the moisture. And so, one way to prevent that transmission is to wear flip-flops in the shower. And then another one that makes the news every now and again is ringworm of the nails. So we see this sometimes associated with certain salons, like specifically like a spa pedicure type place, where someone has nail ringworm and the spores leak out and there's not enough cleaning in between clients and you get an outbreak. So now that we've looked at Tinea, let's turn and take a look at the most clinically important species of fungus that cause infection, and that is Candida albicans. So Candida albicans causes what is called candidiasis, and candidiasis is basically a word that we use to describe some form of candida. Sometimes it's called candida overgrowth or yeast overgrowth. So when you hear about infectious yeast, they're referring to Candida albicans. So Candida albicans is the infectious yeast, which is different than the yeast that you would use to make bread or the yeast that you would find in your beer. Okay, most people have Candida albicans somewhere in their body, most commonly in the mouth, in the digestive system, and also in the vaginal canal, obviously if you're a female. So with that information, let's talk about places where you can have overgrowth. And when you have overgrowth, that elicits an immune response. And the immune response, the inflammatory response, is usually what gives you the symptoms. So common areas where we get local infections are the vaginal canal, we can also have the oral cavity or the mouth, and this gets a special name called thrush. And then the GI tract somewhere, small or large intestine, or even esophagus. Okay, it can use any of these local infections, but I would say the most common seems to be the esophagus and the large intestine as a jumping off point to get into the blood. So we call these seeding infections, SEED, like to plant a seed. So again, these are the initial infections that then spread somewhere else. And so the systemic infection that we see most commonly with Candida is blood. And so this would be known as Candida sepsis. So let's go through each one of these and talk about them somewhat briefly. And then what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take a look at how this happens. So many women experience yeast infection sometime during their life. When they have a yeast infection in their vaginal canal, the Candida basically overgrow and use their hyphae and get into the mucous membrane, and then it produces an inflammatory response. And one of the characteristics of a yeast infection is not only a lot of inflammation, itchiness, but also a certain type of discharge that is largely immune-based. So Candida infections of this type can be treated topically with an antifungal agent like miconazole. A less common place that we do see it is going to be in the mouth. And oral candidiasis is also known as thrush. Sometimes it's just called thrush straight up. And that's going to be an infection of the mouth. And we see this most often in brand new newborns or anybody who's severely immunocompromised. In fact, if an adult has oral thrush, it's actually a pretty big indicator that that person is extremely immunocompromised. So one of the things that we see oral thrush associated with is people that are on like very robust forms of chemotherapy for cancer, or they have AIDS. In addition, we'll often see it in newborns because they don't have a robust immune response yet. But you can see the same type of kind of plaque-like formation in there. You might think to yourself that you could just go in there and scrape that off, but actually it's underneath the tissue, and that white that you see is kind of the inflammatory response to the cells in there. Now, once again, like all fungi, they're making spores. So what's happening is people will have fungi in their mouth or Candida in their mouth, and potentially a lot of it, like here, and then they swallow the spores over and over again, and that ends up allowing that Candida to travel down into the esophagus or maybe even farther down into the digestive system. So that brings us up to the next point, which is kind of like, well, how do we know what Candida is going to do? If we assume that everybody has Candida albicans somewhere in their body, when is it helpful, or when is it pathogenic? When is it life-threatening? And I will say that this is a very complicated question, and our understanding of the answer to this question is still evolving. There were certain dogmas that are now being challenged. So I will put down what we know to be some factors that are implicated in how Candida behaves, and what evidence we have for those factors, and then I'll mention if those ideas are somewhat in flux. So one thing that we know that definitely plays a role in whether or not Candida albicans causes some sort of infection is, what are the other members of the microbiome doing? So we know that the microbiome, or the microflora composition, absolutely impacts Candida. And the general school of thought is this: when you have a robust, varied microbiome, meaning lots and lots and lots of different things in your mouth and your digestive system, mostly bacteria, that tends to take up a lot of space, and Candida albicans can't really dominate. And if it can't dominate, then it probably isn't going to overgrow and cause an infection. So we call this competitive exclusion. In other words, a healthy and robust microbiome basically is your best prevention against Candida dominating some sort of mucous membrane and causing an infection. So what evidence do we have to support that general dogma? And the evidence is that when somebody takes a broad spectrum antibiotic that it targets bacteria, it wipes out a lot of the microflora and subjects them to a yeast infection, either in the intestine, the mouth, or the vaginal canal. So we see that over and over and over again. In fact, some of the Candida infections that you may encounter would be where people are in ICU or on like broad spectrum antibiotics, and they've wiped out all their competing microflora, and Candida's like, hey, look at all this extra space I get. Woohoo, I'm going to dominate now. And then they basically dominate, and it causes an infection. Now, how is that being challenged? Well, it turns out that we're not so sure that's always the case. And sometimes it seems like Candida actually can inhibit other types of infectious microbes. I would say that this school of thought is largely still intact, that, the competing microflora absolutely plays a critical role most of the time in keeping Candida levels low, and thus keeping you below infectious levels. But I wouldn't say that it's 100% of the time. And there's some strong evidence to suggest that Candida actually helps keep other types of pathogens low as well. For instance, there's some evidence to suggest that urinary tract infections go down in people with robust Candida numbers. So interesting. Okay. Something else that we know definitely plays a role in how Candida behaves in your body is going to be your hormones. And this is particularly true for females. And we know this because Candida infections, or yeast infections, are, I wouldn't say exclusively, but pretty close to exclusively found in women that are of reproductive age. So you really don't see too many yeast infections below the age of 13 and once somebody has reached menopause. Now, that's not to say you never see them. I mean, you can see Candida infections in infants, but it's not nearly as common, suggesting that hormones are playing a role in whether or not Candida is allowed to overgrow or the levels drop. And then perhaps the most critical one is the state of your immune system. So if you are immunocompromised, then that seems to invite Candida to cause an infection. And so with that information, the fact that immunocompromised people are most likely to be the ones getting a Candida infection, we can paint this kind of generalized picture of Candida being the consummate opportunist. That is one that is like the poster child for being an opportunistic pathogen. It is in your body, constantly trying to poke and find holes, find opportunities to get in. So remember, we talked about some opportunities that opportunistic pathogens might want to get into, like new environments, an immunocompromised state, the microflora is not competing effectively, etc. And they get in there and they're constantly like, come on, how about now? How about now? Can I grow now? Can I grow now? And your immune system is in constant defense mode. Defend, no. Parry, no. Defend, no, etc. And if your immune system just kind of wanes a little bit, like, I just can't even, then Candida's like taking that opening, smells blood in the water, and takes over. And now you have a Candida infection. So we see that the immune system seems to play a huge role in somebody's susceptibility for a Candida infection, especially a serious one like Candida sepsis. So those that are immunocompetent, meaning their immune system is robust, tend to have fewer, or I would say more localized Candida infections. As your immune system drops, Candida infections become more problematic. So on that note, let's take a look at this interesting little stat here. I'll give you a moment to go ahead and read it. The very first time I taught microbiology, many years ago, I had a student who was fainting in class over and over and over again, and she couldn't figure out what was going on. Her blood pressure would just suddenly drop and she'd pass out. Well, she finally got her blood examined, and guess what they found in her blood? Yeast. She had Candida sepsis. And basically it was being immunocompromised from extreme stress. You know, being in a nursing program is very stressful. Trying to prepare for a nursing program is very stressful. And I thought that was really interesting, so I started doing some research about how do people get Candida sepsis? What's the portal of entry for that? So now let's take a look at what types of things might promote Candida sepsis. In other words, what does it take for Candida to get into the blood? And it turns out that there are two major areas that seem to be seeding locations, meaning that they're the starting location, that Candida migrates from those locations into the bloodstream to actually infect the blood. And Candida blood infections can be fatal. And if they're not caught early enough, as we know from our antibiotic and antimicrobial section, they might not be treated in a timely manner because treating a fungal infection takes a long time. Two of the most important areas that seem to be the starter locations of Candida are going to be the esophagus and the large intestine, with the esophagus probably being a little bit more common. So here I have a histological preparation of the esophagus. Now you might not have any idea what it is you're looking at. But if you were to take somebody's esophagus and you were to do a cross section like right here, and you were to put it on a slide. So here's my slide. Here's what you would see. Kind of looks like that. It's all curly inside because the esophagus is muscular and stretches, etc. So what this histological preparation is looking at is somebody taking a slice like that. and then pulling it over here. So this is going to be where the food is. This is the white space. And then this is all epithelial, stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And what you can see here are the fungi. Those are the actual cells, and you can see them germinating into their hyphae as they kind of burrow down into the esophagus. So you could see then how they could keep burrowing right into the blood, which is farther down. So I actually looked up a couple papers that talked about, well, if somebody has Candida in their mouth, so like a thrush infection, and they're continuously swallowing those spores and they get into their esophagus, they're going to keep germinating. Does that automatically mean that they're going to get a Candida sepsis infection? And it turns out that we can almost mathematically describe the risk of somebody getting Candida sepsis from the esophagus being a seeding point. And so what I want to do is mathematically write that out, and then we'll talk about it. So the more spores that are landing on the esophagus and germinating, the more likely some of them are going to be able to burrow all the way into the bloodstream. On the flip side, what we have, and it's not shown in this image here, but what we have are tissue macrophages that are stationed there, and they're constantly on alert looking for these incoming hyphae, and they're eating them up. So they're eating them up with the assistance of antibodies usually, or some sort of opsonin. Okay, so if you get 10 that land and then germinate, but then your macrophages are right there to eat them up, and so your macrophages are able to phagocytose them, then the risk of them getting past the line of defense of macrophages is 0. So as long as you have enough robust tissue macrophages to kind of, deal with the once in a while hyphae that comes your way, you're fine. Your risk is very low. But as soon as this equation becomes out of balance, then your risk goes up. So what are some things that could influence this balance? Well, first of all, increasing the frequency of Candida spores. If you already have an oral thrush infection, you're swallowing a ton of spores, and I'm not exaggerating, it would be well over a ton. Lots and lots and lots of spores. So even if you have the best managed defenses in your tissue macrophages that are like, come on, eat, you're just bombarding them, spores, germination, and some of them are going to slip through the cracks. Your risk goes way high when this overwhelms your immune system. On the flip side, you can also have this go down. That happens when you become extremely immunocompromised, especially when you're immunocompromised like with AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, where you don't make helper T cells. When you don't make helper T cells, you don't activate your B cells, you don't activate your cytotoxic T cells, but in this case, you don't activate your B cells, you're not continually making high levels of antibodies to bind to those hyphae so that your tissue macrophages have an easy time to eat them. So again, what that means is the tissue macrophages have to work harder to eat just a few, and you can imagine that somebody who has AIDS has both of these things not in their favor. If they already have a thrush infection, they're swallowing huge quantities of Candida spores, and their tissue macrophages are not functioning optimally to consume them. So the risk goes way up. So that seems to be the equation that kind of determines whether or not Candida sepsis is in your future or in your patient's future. How much are they basically exposing to some sort of mucous membrane? And what are the tissue macrophages' abilities to eat up what does come their way? And when either of those swing out of balance, the risk is going to go up. Either you load a ton of spores onto that tissue and or your macrophages are not sufficient at consuming them. So again, Candida sepsis is serious, can be fatal without treatment, and so where you will tend to see it tends to be in the extremely immunocompromised. That said, you can find it often in the intensive care setting, as shown here. Okay, that basically concludes our survey of fungal infections. I hope you're as fascinated by these complex pathogens and their dynamic interactions with us as I am. I'll see you for the next lecture.